in special circumstances, you know. And then again, Indian civilization in the 17th century was certainly not Indian civilization in the time of the Vedas or a few centuries after 18. This being said, I will not say much about India in this context, since you have already given quite a few useful pointers. But I will give a brief analysis of what's happening in the Western world today. And when I say the Western world, I mean the world at large, because we are basically ruled by, we're still under the British Empire, as you know. It's now an English-American empire with some acolytes, but it's still pretty much what we have known for the last 150 years, under different forms and aliases. And it used to be that the West built its empire on the basis of a certain message to the world. And this message was primarily Christianity, along with, from the 18th century onwards, or even before, technical civilization, you know, a certain ability to make things that hadn't been made before, especially for war, but also for production of industrial goods. And then, from the 19th century on, Christianity became somewhat questionable in terms of whether this gave a right to any country to subjugate other parts of the world in the name of imposing a particular religion. And at that point, you could see a shift in the attitude of colonizers, and the theory became focused on transmitting civilizational values. And civilization was supposed to be the civilization of the conqueror, and because the West was powerful, it was obviously better than everything else in its own estimation, and therefore its duty was to make everyone like the West. In other words, have the Western-style family, Western-style religion, Western-style government, and so on and so forth, you know. And it was very culturally conditioned, in the sense, when we spread democracy, we don't say, you know, Russian democracy, we say parliamentary British-style democracy, or American democracy, which is a sort of an avatar of British democracy. But, so that shows how conditioned it was, and along with this civilization, we transmitted, or we imposed, a number of cultural mores and values, including the Judeo-Christian canons, or you might say criteria, which included, as you said, in the biblical tradition, a very strong condemnation of homosexuality in all its forms. And here I'd like to say that what you mentioned in terms of the third sex, voluntary or involuntary eunuchs, in other words, that existed throughout the world. I mean, you found it in Latin America before it was Latin, you found it all over Africa, you found it in China, you found it in Japan, you found it in the Middle East, you found it in South Asia and Southeast Asia. I mean, there was literally, might say 90% of the world, or 80%, which had this institution, which today appears abhorrent because obviously castrating somebody is not something you can justify in a society conscious of human rights. And interestingly, not only was it a penalty, as you said, it was also a choice dictated very often by economic and social reasons. For example, in the West, we castrated people because we wanted them to sing. And since you couldn't have women singing in public because that was indecorous, you had young boys, and when they're not so young anymore and they lost their feminine voices, then you castrated them in order to make them into these singers who became so famous and some of them so rich, you know, like, I mean, we have several examples of that. And this was regarded as perfectly in harmony with Christian law, because the church actually was a great consumer of eunuchs in the sense that it used eunuchs for its church music. And there was absolutely no moral question about it. But then I would say that moral issues are highly relative, because when you look at American society, which was built, American independence was built on the foundation of human equality and equal rights, and yet it was founded on slavery too, and then on genocide, and they didn't see any problem with that. It was, well, you know, we mean equality for us, but not for people who are not like us, you know. When Australia was declared independent, again, on the basis of equality, they still had the Aborigines in chains and treated like animals and hunted and shot for bounty. So this being said, we have to be very careful about moral values as they are promoted at one time or another, because they can change enormously. And in the case of the present moral values, they have obviously drastically changed, because now the word moral has become almost a dirty word, and you are told that there is no real morality, at least no religious morality, and you should just go by what basically gives you pleasure. And that goes with a whole complete reversal of most values. For example, it used to be that before anything came duty to society, or duty to your faith, or duty to your community or family. Now we see that the fundamental principle is the individual rights to whatever you think you are entitled to. And within that concept of rights has come also the concept of sexual enjoyment. But the problem is that it has been equated with love. And in the West now we have a complete, subconscious assimilation of love to lust. In the sense that if there is any lust or desire, then that's automatically justified because it's love. And therefore you cannot judge love. And in the phenomenological and philosophy, which has become very prevalent in the last 75 years, we have this famous Husserlian, named after Edmund Husserl, suspension of judgment, in the sense you shouldn't judge. Therefore, nothing should be judged on moral grounds, because moral grounds imply that you're actually introducing a cultural and a religious criteria. The problem, however, is that there is a lot of hypocrisy in suspending judgment, because we never suspend judgment on everything. We are judgmental beings, no matter what we say. I mean, we are not going to like what we are not used to, or what we think is detrimental to our interests. So, for example, you can say to someone, fine, so let's not be judgmental. So how can you judge Hitler? I mean, he had some very good things going, so let's not judge. And of course, in the West, you'll get thrown out if you say that, because they say, how dare you, this is completely unacceptable. So, judgmental, I mean, obviously, you will have to be at some point. The question is where you draw the line. And that's where, of course, I would go back to what you were saying about not necessarily identifying nature to culture, because culture can create very different practices which can then be regarded as natural. For example, in the 18th century Europe or America, you would be told that it was natural for Africans to be slaves because they were inferior. And it was natural for women to not to vote because they didn't have enough of a brain to vote. I mean, this was actually defended by very enlightened people in the late 19th century. As you know, in France, we gave the right to vote to women only in the 60s, and this was a lot of irritation. And Switzerland did it even later, and yet it's a very progressive country. So you have to be very careful about the way that things are presented. And what happened since the 60s has been the introduction of this culture of absolute equality, equal rights, rejection of taboo. And interestingly, if you look at the 60s, particularly 68, you will see that quite a few prominent spokesmen for that sort of uprising against traditional values, including people like Cohn-Bendit, they were not only advocating free sex, but also free sex with children. And of course, that is now not so cool, as they say in America, but there was a time, there are still, believe me, lots of people covertly promoting sexual liberty with children in the West. And these people are sometimes very highly placed, and they will get what they want, and they will pay for it. That's why you have such a gigantic problem of child pornography. Now, this along, you have this so-called liberation of instincts, which means no more taboos. And we have seen the effect of it in the proliferation of pornography. And the proliferation of pornography, the obsession with sex, has led to some very bizarre results. For example, it's interesting if you hear the interviews of many of the Iraqis and Afghans who were captured by the Americans. Many of them say that the major interest in the Americans were in parading them naked and filming their genitals, and there was a real obsession with that. And they were saying, what's wrong with these people? Why are they so obsessed with seeing us naked? And unfortunately, that's a very dark side of Western society, in particular American society, this complete sort of subsuming of the human condition with sex and sexual pleasure. And that, of course, has an effect in all aspects of sexual activity, including homosexuality, which has become a sort of an experimental pleasure like drugs. And that's why you have this so-called recreational aspect of it, which is why you use euphemisms, which in my mind are not very meaningful, such as saying, for example, gay. Why has the word gay become mandatory? It meant something completely different until 50, 60 years ago, and now there is American jargon, which has been imposed on everyone, to the point where countries which don't speak English will use that, because it's a sort of American hip thing to say. You know, that shows how artificial this thing is, you know, how much it comes from a sort of a cultural conditioning, which doesn't come from the grassroots. It comes from some high places, it comes from some very privileged people. And we can see that it is part of a process of social engineering, which has become biological engineering. And to the point where now in French schools they want to introduce, even at the level of kindergarten, discussions with children to tell them that they have a choice of sex and what would they prefer to be. And in Germany now they have passed a law that in a hospital, in a clinic, a child doesn't have to be given a sex for a while. You have to wait and see, and they can be registered under the third sex. And obviously when you're dealing with an infant, you certainly don't know what he's going to choose to be. Therefore, you are just putting a choice on them. And this has been, in a way, the fight of the traditionalists or conservatives against the adoption of homosexual marriage, because they said you are not giving a choice to children, basically. You see, you are deciding that they will be born in a homosexual family, and in many cases now we have a flourishing trade in children, as we know from, for example, a country like Israel, which has set up a real business with India, where they essentially all the children have a woman from a relatively depressed social stratum carry their child after being inseminated, and then when the child is born, it's sent to the homosexual parents. And there have already been some rather shocking cases where meanwhile the two partners had separated, therefore nobody wanted the child. And at the same time the mother who had carried the child had been paid to carry the child, but was not supposed to even be known to the child, because, you know, once she is only an anonymous womb, as it were. So there are a lot of moral and cultural issues that are raised by that, and I think we should be very careful where we are going, because we could find ourselves before very essentially painful human situations, and generally when you have that kind of crisis, you have very violent reactions arising at some point. And these violent reactions can be then very unpleasant, because they can take the form of the equivalent of race wars. You know, is that you have, for example, a very great social tension between communities that have been artificially forced to live together without having the proper preparation or the proper circumstances to coexist peacefully, then you will have clashes. And I think you will have incidences of repression and incidences of injustice because of the very situation you are creating. For example, let's see the attitude of the so-called moral teachers of the world, especially the US and the European Union. They have decided that whoever they deal with, they will force them to adopt immediately some rules which will be in consonance with their own criteria. For example, they will talk to Russia and say, you know, we don't like you because you are not giving homosexuals the right to marry. And therefore, you are no longer communists, but we still don't like you, because there are all these things that you are not doing well. Now, what you have in reaction in some countries, such as Serbia, such as some other countries of Eastern Europe, are vigilante groups which are now beating up homosexuals to show that they are not going to give in to the pressure from the West and that they have their own cultural values. Now, why would anybody choose to promote that kind of strife within societies instead of essentially trying to bring about a message of tolerance and peace, but also respecting the cultural traditions and trying to modify them gradually, not giving them a sort of a reading the riot act and saying, you know, now we have the revealed truth, and it used to be Christianity, now it's not Christianity, forget about that, it's something different, but we have it, it's called, you know, universal human values, and you better respect them, otherwise we're going to put you under some sort of sanctions. I mean, frankly, it reminds me of what Iran has been under for supposedly trying to make an atom bomb, which has never been proven. You know, everybody, lots of other countries have made atom bombs and nothing happened, including Pakistan. But Iran, of course, is absolutely unacceptable. Why? Because a few people have decided that Iran shouldn't have any kind of capability to have ever any kind of nuclear energy. Now, this is the kind of intolerant and basically racist attitude that you observe, and I think it has to be dealt as it is, as for what it is, which is essentially a new form of colonialism, which is insidious, but which can be as damaging as the previous kind. Thanks.
Thank you so much.